you, Commissioner. Ms. Jolie, my name is Prabjot Singh for the Sikh Coalition. If we can pull up WIT 96, please. And we can go to page 5, the bottom of page 5. So, Ms. Jolie, just before we start, I want to clarify something, so we can get a little bit of a baseline. In your witness statement from the phase 1 of the inquiry, it sounds like you weren't briefed of Indian foreign interference until the spring of 2023. In your testimony earlier, you alluded to an earlier briefing, potentially when you traveled to India. Are you able to clarify when you first learned about Indian foreign interference?
What I learned, I think, in February 2023, I know that I'm going to India for the first time in my position for a bilateral visit because 2-3 weeks later, I go as the Minister of Foreign Affairs for G20 because I know that India was in charge of the G20 meeting that year. So I have information. I'm briefed on the fact that India has complaints or concerns on the fact that there's a pro-Khalistan movement in Canada. So I have to be ready to, how can I say, to counter India's arguments, but I don't have information at that time as to foreign interference from India in Canada on particularly representatives of the Sikh community. That I learned later.
Given the fact that you were appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2021, I'm struggling to understand why you wouldn't have been briefed about this threat earlier, given some of the concerning activities of India in Canada, given the intelligence that Canadian agencies have, and the significance of this information in order for you to effectively represent Canada's interests abroad and with your partners. Were you ever given an explanation for why you weren't briefed on this earlier?
Well, I said earlier, Canada, at the Department of Foreign Affairs, I'm not in charge of surveillance agencies in Canada, CSIS, or all the other surveillance agencies or police agencies like the RCMP. That's the Minister of Public Safety who's in charge, who can see the intelligence. And what was shown is that there was a problem, a communication gap, because the information did not come up to my office on what diplomats in Canada were doing. So if there was, how can I say, pressures, as we know it was the case, against Sikh dissidents, and it wasn't necessarily done through diplomats, it was under the public safety minister's purview. So it's a sad but normal reason for the Minister of Foreign Affairs not to be informed. The first time that I really heard that there was a Canadian who had been murdered in Canada, Mr. Nija, and that we thought that there were Indian government agents that were involved, that was in August 2023, and that's where I was involved in the issue. Before that, unfortunately, I had not been informed.
And so given that reality, that's incredibly helpful, actually. I think you would agree that that's an incredibly alarming and unfortunately tragic gap in communication, that you only learned about India's activities several months before an assassination occurred in Canada. That would have been or should have been information you should have known in order to potentially, considering the tools that your ministry has to combat foreign interference. Had you had that awareness earlier, there may have been more actions that could have been taken. Is that fair?
La question est hypothétique.
Well, what happened with Mr. Jujhar was completely unacceptable, and I often heard it said that there were Sikh members members of the Sikh communities who did not feel safe. But was the security agency's work done properly? Was it complete? I don't know. It's not my responsibility. But we know that it had tragic consequences, and Mr. Nijjar was killed. And I know that there's still concerns in the community in terms of activities of India. At the same time, what I needed to manage was that India was saying that India was not protecting its diplomats, which was completely false. They were saying that Canada does not respect the Vienna Convention, which also was false. So in the context of diplomatic tension with India, even before the Prime Minister announced or made his statements in the House of Commons on about Mr. Nijjar's murder, what I did to ensure that we have no problem with the fact that India was trying to say that we had a double standard was to expel the Indian diplomats here in Canada. And that's when I became really involved in the file of threats against the community.
Thank you for that context. I just want to hone in on that point that there was a communication gap, which I think that you do accept. So when we're looking at this extrajudicial killing that occurred in Canada, I think you described it as a massive violation of Canada's sovereignty.
Right.
I think you'd agree that it's also the most egregious example of foreign interference we've seen. Out of all the countries that target Canada or Canadian institutions, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, no other country has assassinated a Canadian citizen in Canada. Is that fair?
Ben, pas que je me souvienne, non.
Not that I know. No, I have no other examples to provide. However, has Russia carried out extraterritorial murders? Yes, I'm thinking of what happened in Great Britain and what happened in Germany. So obviously there are other states don't have our best interests at heart, who have done it in our partner friends, such as Britain and
Canada is quarterbacking the response. This is unprecedented. And so you mentioned that once you were briefed about the intelligence about India's involvement, you engaged in discussions with your foreign affairs minister counterpart.
Right.
India expelled 41 diplomats. Is it fair to say that India has been adamant in denying responsibility and acknowledging its problematic actions in this case?
Oui, c'est vrai.
And last September, after the
yes, that's true. And sincerely, that is a problem.
September, after the Prime Minister's announcement about India's involvement, the RRM actually observed a coordinated disinformation campaign targeting Canada, correct?
Oui. Une campagne de désinformation coordonnée.
Yes, a disinformation campaign that was coordinated in Canada and against the Prime Minister specifically. And it was a disinformation campaign which was unfortunately quite efficient, because even Canadian traditional media referred to the fact that there were Indian media who were saying that the Prime Minister, for example, had drugs on his plane, which is completely absurd. And we saw that in Canadian media who took up these allegations. And became involved in this disinformation campaign against Canada. And Madam Commissioner, it shows how there's a problem where disinformation from other states can also influence our own media ecosystem here and can have an impact on our democracy.
Today about the tools available to Canada to respond to foreign interference, and that most of those are actually diplomatic, whether that's private communications, whether that's public denouncements, PNGing diplomats, sanctions, downgrading ties. So I'm hoping that you can tell us more about Canada's approach to India's foreign interference after this incident. We know that, that diplomat who was the Raw station chief was PNG'd.
Right.
Trade talks were suspended in September. But in concrete terms, can you talk about how India will be held accountable in a way that's effective in countering and deterring India's constant attacks against Canada and the Sikh diaspora? And does that include holding those officials accountable who actually orchestrated and ordered this assassination on Canadian soil?
Je pense qu'il y a deux choses. Il y a
I think there are two things there. There's the work done by the RCMP here, because that work continues. There were arrests, as you know, and at the same time, the RCMP continues to carry out its investigation. And we respect that. We're a rules, the primacy of they're a rules-based country, so we respect the independence of the investigation. The other thing is, on a diplomatic level, we maintained a diplomatic relationship, but we also exerted a lot of pressure because it's a very tense relationship. It's very difficult now. And we're asking for the collaboration of the Indian government because we want to make those who were involved in this murder accountable. And especially, we want to prevent any other murders occurring because the threat is there. And that's why earlier I said that there were three principles. We will continue to seek the truth, to shed light on what's happening, to exert diplomatic pressure to get the collaboration. We're going to work with the U.S. and other countries. We will also let the RCMP do its work. The second thing, we will work to keep Canadians safe, to protect Canadians. That's the message I want to give. And that's why the more this is made public, the more the Commission advances in its work, and I talk about it in other countries, we can better protect Canadians. And thirdly, it's protecting our sovereignty. If we let this happen, it means that any country can continue to do this and feel very comfortable operating in Canada without consequences.
One quick follow-up just to clarify that response.
Just to clarify, not another question.
Sure.
Because
So I specifically was asking about whether those Indian officials who orchestrated and ordered the assassination will also be held accountable under this strategy.
Mais c'est sûr que c'est l'objectif.
Yes, that's the goal. But we have to shed light on what happened exactly. That's why the RCMP is doing that work. I have nothing to protect the diplomatic relationship. My goal is to shed light on what happened and that the people involved be held responsible. Why? Because Canada thinks that when somebody kills somebody, the person who has done the murder has to be held responsible. That's how our system functions. And
Thank you.
I